hope you're doing well. It's pretty chilly this morning, and I hope you're staying warm. So let's start with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your grace and mercy that are new every morning. Lord, without your mercy, we will not be breathing. And Lord, this life belongs to you. This life is a gift from you. And this is short and limited. But Lord, this is a window, small window, narrow window by which we can experience you, meet you, and receive the gift of salvation. So Father God, we ask you that you will speak to each one of the students, Lord God, today, and may your grace abound where there are difficulties. Father God, cover each one of us, Lord God, with your blood, spirit, mind, and body, so that we may be able to glorify you. Lord, we thank you. In Christ's name we pray. Okay, so we talked about Abraham a little bit. His original name was Abram, and later you get to see why it changed to Abraham. The h sound means the Spirit of God, and so Hebrew word language is pretty interesting in that not only each alphabet has symbolic and prophetic meaning, certain words have certain meaning beyond what it initially refers to. It has deeper, like it has layers of meanings, and so it's interesting to study. In terms of sound, Abraham becomes Abraham, meaning the father of nations, and that k sound means God's spirit has been poured upon him. So now he does not belong to the idols that he used to worship, but now he belongs to God. And that name change is pretty significant because in the Hebraic world, they named each child. In this case, God named him differently, but each child was named by their father, and it was prophetic. It was a blessing. It was a prophetic message over that individual, and so names were very important. Contrary to that, I think Asian people understand this a little bit better because in an Asian culture, we also name each child. Parents name the children. It used to be the father, right, in the patriarchal society, but now it's changing that, mom and dad put their heads together, or sometimes, grandparents actually participated in it. They really give it a thought and name you. And I believe that Chinese characters of your names, or even, Korean names, have some deeper meaning than what it sounds, right? Chinese characters are more like pictorial, and Korean letters are more phonetic, but still there's a meaning behind each word, right? Each word of each letter of the name. And so we understand that a little bit better, and certainly names are very important, and most often people in the Bible, actually, they're the real people. It's not a fake story. It's not a fairy tale. Real people, real names. And they lived up to that prophetic message of the meaning of their names. If it was a name that was not such a blessing, for example, Jacob, Yaakov, means a heel grabber. It means, it doesn't mean good. You grab other people's heel, and you take their place. It's deception, right? It's cheating. But because heel grabbing, according to Hebraic culture and their understanding, it means cheating. Interestingly, when Jacob was born, he was born as one of the twins of the two sons, right? The male twins, and his older brother Esau. I mean, they're practically of the same age, right? But then Esau came out of the womb 1 minute before Jacob did, and actually when he was born, somebody grabbed his heel, and that was Jacob coming right after him, and so that's why he was named that. But during the first few years of his life, he he really acted as a heel grabber, a deceiver. However, like a cheater. But later on, because he came into the hands of God, he was in the hands of God. He was greatly transformed, and toward his latter part of his life, he completely transformed, and God gave him a new name, Israel. You wrestled with God and you overcame. Meaning, like, you cannot possibly overcome God, right? Any human being, the most powerful human being would not be able to wrestle with God and overcome. But God actually allowed Jacob to win because he saw his desire, such a great desire to receive spiritual inheritance. And so then he named him again, like, you're not Jacob anymore, you're not heel grabbing anymore, but you wrestled with God and overcame, and you are gonna be the Abraham's descendant. Although you're the second son, it was supposed to go through the first son's line, right? Naturally, but by primogeniture of Hebraic culture. But it went through Jacob, the second son, because he so longed for the spiritual inheritance. He wanted to be the source of blessing that Abraham was, that was going to, God's promise being fulfilled through him. That's what he desired. And so, but his name changed, and that's pretty significant. And he lived up to that prophetic message of the new name. And so, like I said, Abraham becomes Abraham later, and we're going to talk about it. But let's start with a word of prayer. We already prayed, so let's talk about Genesis 15. We briefly touched on this last time. However, we want to just kind of do a little more of overview because there's an in-depth understanding to this passage. Genesis chapter 15. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. So this is like when he became even older, he took up on a journey when he was 75, but this is like 80 something years old. I think he was like 90, and he still did not have the child, the son that God had promised to give him. And so probably along this journey, he was thinking as like 5 years passed, 7 years passed, 10 years passed. Well, God promised me that I will have a son, but maybe if God is capable of doing the miracles, which I first believed, then he would have done it like now, because I'm getting old and I'm getting closer to the age of being deceased. I mean, I'm going to pass away, and my wife will pass away, and so perhaps God meant something else, like God would give me someone who is not of my wife's womb, not of my seed, but someone who is already there. Maybe this is going to be my son. So his faith is a little bit shaky because the picture isn't what he had imagined. The picture is not his expectation. So then he actually is listening to God. Do not be afraid, Abram. God says this a lot. He understands that people have fears, and especially when he appears there's such a sense of awe, and so he's trying to really comfort and encourage these people who encounter him. And also at the same time, there's Abram probably felt that he was going to pass away before he has a child, and he probably dealt with a lot of fears too along the journey. The journey was not very smooth. He faced famine, droughts. He also almost lost his wife, and there was a complicated war that he had to fight for the sake of his own family, but to rescue his nephew Lot. And it was just not a very smooth journey. Although he kept obeying God, he stumbled a few times, but he got up and believed God again, stumbled and believed God again. And God credited that obedience or faith as righteousness, right? So at this point, he's pretty disappointed, but Abraham said, "Sovereign Lord, what can you give me, since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus." Isn't it interesting? I am your shield. God says, "I'm your shield, your very great reward." So I am your protection, and I am your reward, great reward. Instead of, "I will give you this and that." I mean, God promised that too. God said, "I will give you a child, and many nations, like, your descendants will be as many as the stars in the sky and the grains of the sand. However, I will also give you this land," right? So his promises are great, and these are visible things. But he says, "I am your very great reward." There's something to think about. We sometimes ask God to give us something, and oftentimes we hear the yes, no, wait, I'll change your mind, there could be different answers, but he does answer. He answers all the time. There's no prayer that is not answered. It's just that sometimes his answers don't seem to reflect what we originally asked for. And we sometimes don't understand what's going on, but if we cling to him, because God is really faithful. Like one of his primary characteristics is that he's holy, he's loving, but he's also very faithful. And his love never fails, because love and faithfulness go together. And his love is faithful. And so when he says something that would happen, then no matter what the circumstances look like, say, in this case, you said that you will give me a child, but I remain childless for like over 10 years. Like what else can be given to me? At this point, I don't need anything, right? And so he says, my Eliezer, one of his faithful servants, like maybe he will be my, successor. And Abram said, "You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir." Then the word of the Lord came to him, "This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir." So what he means by that is you don't adopt a person to become your heir, but out of your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." So there are just countless stars. If you go to a countryside somewhere, like an island, I've been to Hawaii before and Kona, and back in those days it was especially not touched by human hands too much. There was lesser development. I mean, Oahu and Maui were probably very much developed, but Kona was really not very much touched at that time. And the air was so fresh, and if you just look at the island itself, it looks like a paradise, right? And the sky was so clear, no smog, no pollution whatsoever, right? And so not only the ocean was so warm and clear, and fish and turtles were not afraid of human beings because they were well treated. I think that's what it's supposed to be everywhere we go, right? The animals should feel safe around us, and not just the pet dogs or pet cats, but just the animals in the nature should feel safe around human beings. But unfortunately, we've done a lot of harm, and they run away when they see us. I wonder, although trees and plants can't speak, they're also afraid of us too. Yeah, so in Hawaii, if the sun sets, we could see the countless number of stars in the sky. They were big, and sometimes because I grew up in a big city, it was very much polluted, by all the emissions from automobiles and things like that. Now, we could see just a few stars. We could actually count them, and there were times as we grew up, we started to see giant stars sometimes, and we're like, whoa, where did that star come from? Last night, because we tended to go outside a lot as kids, and we would ask our dad, where did that star come from? And he would give us an answer actually that's not a star, but it's a satellite, And so we grew up in that kind of environment, but when I went to Hawaii, it was very different. I don't think all these shiny, beings that I was watching were satellites. They were real stars. It's just that when you go to a place where the nature has been really damaged by pollution, then you can't see as many stars as in Hawaii. And so at that time, as I was watching these stars, I was just fascinated how many there were, and how big and clear they were, and how shiny. Now, if you have seen that kind of sky, then you understand this passage. God says, look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. So your offspring basically is going to be countless. There will be a great multitude of your descendants. I'm pretty sure that this was really puzzling for Abraham, because he didn't even have a single child all his life, and now he's 80 something, and he probably 90, and he still doesn't have a child, right? But this is what God confirms. God is a God of mighty power. He is mighty. He is God of miracles. Yahweh is the God of miracles. And he is also a God of great reversal. And so whatever we can imagine, and oftentimes we are kind of limited by what we have experienced in the past, what we heard other people said, and what scholars or professionals and all these maybe news reporters, whoever that are kind of influential through media, all kinds of media. When I say media, I'm not just talking about TV or radio or internet, but I'm also talking about those people who publish in magazines, or come up with research results, and these people who are kind of bigger than human figures, these influential people, the leaders whose words really count. We tend to listen to them, and then we come to a conclusion. If these professionals, or if these people who are so experienced, or if these people who are so wise and so accurate so far, and scientific, or whatever the reason is, then we tend to say, oh, then forget other kinds of possibilities because don't even try. I mean, like there's almost zero chance of this happening. That's what God can do. When God can step in is possibility zero. When people say, that's ridiculous because you're not gonna actually get it, or you're not gonna see it happen because like there's no way, this is like completely ridiculous. When you hear that, of course I'm not saying that any childish dreams come true. I mean, we used to dream that we could fly like a Superman, or that we can actually do some kind of miracles on our own, right? So I'm not talking about those experiences, but rather something like when we heard from God. So we want to make sure that we hear from God. It's not our own imaginations, or it's not, sometimes God gives us imaginations too. God-given imaginations actually can unfold and come to fruition. However, it's not just like idealistic, daydreaming kind of things that I'm talking about. I'm talking about God's promises that seem to be impossible, or God-given imaginations that you have that people say, like the comment of, are you out of your mind? This is impossible, can come true because God is a God of miracles, and He is a God of reversal, great reversal. And He is sovereign. So His will is done even when we are feeble. His will is done even when we're personally, humanly impossible to carry it out. And so that's when people know, and we ourselves know, that, oh, it is God who made this happen. Glory to Him. He is truly the God of great reversal. He is truly God of great miracles, is the conclusion that we arrive at, right? And so that's when His name is glorified, His name is known. And so that's what's happening with Abraham right now. So let's continue. So shall your offspring be, like countless stars, right? And Abraham believed the Lord, and He credited it to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abraham said, so after he explained himself, he doesn't have to explain himself. He just gave him another prophetic message about who he was. He just revealed himself to Abraham, like, I am your God, do not be afraid. I'm your shield and your great reward. And he goes on to say, I'm going to give you this land. I took you out of Ur of Chaldeans in order for you to actually possess this land. But Abraham says, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So at this point, Abraham is asking for confirmation. So the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Then he brought all these to him. So Abraham brought all the animals to God and cut them in two and laid each half opposite the other, but he did not cut the birds. So although there were no specific instructions, he knew exactly what to do with the animals, because it was commonly practiced that when the animals were brought in, well, unless it's for cooking or for making them work or whatever, then they automatically knew from cultural backgrounds and just historical, just by tradition, they knew that it was for entering into a covenant. So Abraham just asked God, how do I know that I will take possession of the land? Now he wants a confirmation, And as a confirmation, what God is doing is, okay, bring out the animals. And he's like, I am entering into a covenant with you. Can you imagine a great God who created the universe actually enters into a covenant with a mere human being that he created with his own hands? But he does. He's such a humble God. Many of the gods that we know are kind of, they could be, you know, they could be powerful, they could be beautiful, or whatever the characteristics are, but we haven't seen too many humble gods, right? But Yahweh is God of humility. If there's anybody who demonstrates humility, and when I say humility, I'm not talking about people with low self-esteem. I'm not talking about people who deny every single time people say nice things about them. I'm not talking about people who just act with no confidence, or like or who are not able to really see themselves in a positive view. I'm talking about those individuals, although they have a healthy view of themselves, they know who they are before God. They are kind of open to hear what other people have to say, and kind of understand that they don't necessarily know all the answers to questions. They're the ones who understand, remain kind of flexible, because what they have in mind may not be the answer, it may not be the idea, may not be the truth, but rather they're open and they constantly want to learn. But that's human beings, right? I mean, we need to learn constantly, we need to be open-minded and all that, but God already, he does know everything. He knows all the answers. But how is it that he's so humble, that he lowers himself to the level of a human being in order to enter into a covenant? A covenant is a very serious business. I told you about that, right? These days people make promises and they break it so much. And so I recommend that if you are a parent, or if you're an expectant parent, try to keep your word, because that's very important in building trust with your children, with your spouses, with anybody that you cherish. But oftentimes people really take promises lightly and just come up with excuses. Oh, I couldn't keep it because of this and that, right? But we want to keep them because we want to build trust with people. And God is a promise maker and he's a promise keeper. So back to the fact that he is faithful. So he is very faithful, but then Abraham did not have that understanding yet. He saw a few things, you know, in the midst of all the problems and the journey, you know, going into Egypt, you know, trying to get some food, you know, because there was a famine, and then, you know, almost losing his wife and things like that. He went through a lot, and time after time, actually, God had proven his faithfulness to Abraham, but he still wanted to actually see, like, you and I are human beings, and we know that spiritual matters and spiritual principles are invisible. And you and I understand that. I mean, you know, not all of us, but, you know, hopefully, if you have been to my class before, and if you understand spiritual matters a little bit, like we understand that what we see is not everything, but there are some invisible matters, right? And so we know that, but we sometimes want to see with our own physical eyes the promises or manifestations or evidences, right? And so I think that's what Abraham wanted. And so God knew. And God goes, because I know that you want to believe me, but you want to be strengthened in your belief, and therefore you want to see something from me. And so God is saying, bring out the animals. And Abraham knows exactly what's going on. He knows that God wants to enter into a covenant with himself. And isn't it humbling? When God comes down, he is like, yes, I am willing to communicate with you in the ways that you can understand. And so that's what he's doing right now. And so he bring out the animals, and he cut them in half, and there's a blood that gushes out of the animals, right? And he actually stayed there. This happened during the daytime, and the sun started to set. It becomes kind of dark. During the winter, we see that the sun sets pretty soon, right? And so the sun was setting, and the birds started to come because they, smell the blood, and they want to eat the carcass and things like that, right? Now, God appears in the form of a blazing fire. So that's totally humanly impossible to make happen, right? Out of the blue, like suddenly fire comes from heaven. And probably Abraham remembered this moment. This is a very, very impactful moment. His heart was, touched, and he probably remembered this significant and amazing moment forever. He probably would not be able to forget this moment. So birds came, and he chased them out. Now, he did that so why did God, it puzzles me. If God wanted to actually enter into a covenant, why did he, make him wait until the sun was setting, right? He could have done it right there then. So I don't have all the answers to all the questions about the Bible, but it looks like God sometimes uses this waiting. Number one, God is worth waiting for. Number two, certain things that we desire is so important and valuable that we need to wait for it. So now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. And God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. And as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age. Then in the fourth generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And it came about when the sun had set, that it was very dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven, and a flaming torch which passed between these pieces. So in the old era, when the animals were cut for the purpose of covenant making, the two representatives, usually it was a tribal covenant, and the two tribal heads, the pieces of the animal, and it was saying that this covenant will last forever. And also they're saying that it is going to be a very serious promise. If anybody breaks it, then let this kind of death happen to us, is what they mean. And so that's what God did, appearing as a blazing torch. He actually manifested, and he passed through passed through in between the animal pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, "To your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, the Canaanite and the Kenizzite and the Cadmonite, and the Hittite and the Perizzite and the Rephaim, and the Amorite and the Canaanite and the Girgashite and the Jebusite." So the land was already occupied by these people. But God was saying, "I'm giving you this land because I'm the sovereign God who is the sovereign Lord over all the creation. Like, this land belongs to me, and you and your descendants, you will go in peace. After so many years of living, you'll have a peaceful death. But then your descendants will actually come here and live here, and there will be oppressors. But in the end, after 400 years, they will come out with great possessions." That's what he's saying. This promise of God to come true. Not only because it involved having a child, but because a couple is one flesh, and God's promises come to and through a household. It's like, the church is the same way, right? Although we are apart, believers are apart, and there are many individuals and perhaps many denominations, but still, God's promise for His kingdom comes through the church corporately, and God's promises are fulfilled for the church in a corporate sense. And so, just like that, from an individualistic culture's perspective, it's harder for us to understand what that means. And we are very much living in a fragmented society where we could actually separate different aspects of our lives, personal, public life, work life, leisure life, family life, and just network life, or whatever that might be. So then we tend to look at things fragmentedly, or we look at things from an individualistic perspective. But God works through, His idea is that all His creation, so even if there's like a generation gap, like between what happened, Abraham, this happened thousands of years ago, and what happened through Jesus 2,000 years ago, and what we're experiencing right now, they're all connected. And God sees that all the human beings that He created are actually siblings from His perspective. And so His heart is very much broken when He sees any tribe or any group of people or any one individual says God doesn't exist, or I don't believe in Jesus, I don't believe in Creator God, and things like that, because they're all His creation, and He loves each one of us as His own children. And so from that perspective, like, His promises are coming through, and His kingdom comes through. So it involved Sarai very much, but she was tired of waiting. I think for anybody, waiting might be the hardest thing. If there's a great promise or something beautiful that was supposed to come, and you just have to wait, and there's nothing that you can actually do in order to make it sooner, come sooner, or you can't pull it, to your side, and so you feel powerless, basically. And so waiting can be really hard, and it can be discouraging at times. So Sarah was going through that, and she thought to herself, so like very similar to what Abraham did. Abraham said, you know, Eliezer, my servant, will be my heir, and why don't you bless him and let all your promises come through him, because he is younger and he has more potential. And so, but God said, you know, it has to be your own flesh and blood that your heir comes, and wait for that. And Sarah probably heard that through Abraham, but now she's tired of waiting, and now she chooses her Egyptian servant called Hagar, because she was a younger woman. And so she suggests to Abraham, you know, why don't you go into her, and a child will come out of her. Perhaps that's going to be our heir. So Abraham, being a caring and good husband, he listens to her. It's very significant that NASB version that I'm reading actually says he listened to Sarah. He listened to the voice of Sarah. So it was certainly not the voice of God, but the voice of Sarah. And so it's very difficult to reject, like if you have your own family and your own spouse says something, but that is not necessarily God's voice. But because of the relationship and because you're one, it's really hard to reject. And you know, come to think of it, you know, Abraham is seeing that Sarah is getting older and older, and he's like, you know, yeah, you're right. You know, I think we need to make it happen sooner. And so they're doing whatever they can in order to make the promises of God happen. And after Abraham had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife Sarah took Hagar, the Egyptian, her maid, and gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight. So in the old times, and especially in the Hebrew culture, children were considered as gifts from God, and I think we still believe that. And conversely, if you don't have a child, you're considered as being cursed by God. And so then this Egyptian servant, Hagar, a younger person, she conceived, and she's like, okay, you are like as good as dead, and I am going to actually bring out an heir. My son is going to inherit, and you know, will be the first son, will inherit everything. So she started to mistreat, she started to despise her mistress, Sarah. And Sarah said to Abram, may the wrong done me be upon you. I gave my maid into your arms, but when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her sight. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarah, behold, your maid is in your power. Do to her what is good in your sight. So basically, Sarah was complaining, you know, this is not right. And Abram says, like, do to her whatever you want to do. She's your servant. And so she treated her harshly, and Hagar fled from her presence. She ran away. Now the angel of the Lord found Hagar by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, Sarah's maid, where have you come from and where are you going? So it's not that God does not know where she came from and why she fled and where she's going. God is all-knowing, but when he asks, like, where are you going, this is not a question, a genuine question, but rather a rhetorical question. I know where you're going, but tell me your situation, because he wants to hear directly from us. And Hagar said, I'm fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress, and submit yourself to her authority. So instead of leaving her in the wilderness, he says, yeah, go back. Moreover, the angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly multiply your descendants so that they shall be too many to count. This is very similar to what he had promised to Abraham. Isn't it interesting that he makes this promise to a non-Hebraic person? Because Hagar belongs to the Egyptian race, which is, Egyptians are not the chosen people. But God cares about all his creation, and even if it's a human mistake by which this happened, he is willing to bless. So he promises another great promise for Sarai or Hagar. So return to your mistress and submit to her. So she came back, and it says, the angel of the Lord said to her further, behold, you are with child, and you shall bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has given heed to your affliction, and he will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him, and he will live to the east of all his brothers. Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, thou art a God who sees. For she said, have I even remained alive here after seeing him? Therefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore Ishmael. And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. So Abram is getting older and older, and finally, they had a child, but then it was not through Sarah and Abram, but through a younger servant called Hagar. And this is not God's miracle coming through, because what God promised was it will be the flesh and blood of Abram and Sarah herself, although they were as good as dead, as old as dead. Now, when Abram was 99 years old, and this is pretty much like 24 years after, right? The Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. He's saying, I am capable of doing all things. I am all powerful. Walk before me and be blameless. This does not mean perfection of behaviors, but rather hold on to me, have this obedient heart, and believe me is what he's saying. And I will establish my covenant between me and you again, right? And I will multiply you exceedingly. And Abraham fell on his face, and God talked to him, saying, as for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I will make you the father of a multitude of nations, and I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come forth from you, and I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout their generations, for everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your descendants after you. So God's covenant promises are everlasting. And I will give to you and to your descendants after you the land of sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. God said further to Abram, now as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you, throughout their generations. This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. So the second covenant is not dividing, cutting the animals, but rather circumcision. So do this in your entire household, and this will be a symbolic ritual between you and me, that I am your God and you are my people. So do this. And you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be the sign of the covenant between you and me. And every male among you who is 8 days old shall be circumcised throughout your generations. A servant who is born in the house, or who is bought with money from any foreigner, who is not of your descendants, a servant who is born in your house, or who is bought with your money, shall surely be circumcised. Thus shall my covenant be in your flesh, and for an everlasting covenant. So animal cutting was such a vivid scene, but if it's on your skin and you just see it every day, right, then it's a much more of a daily reminder of the fact that God is your God and that you are his people. An uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. So basically, keep the terms, be faithful to me. Then God said to Abraham, as for Sarah, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah. Another ha is placed in her name. Sarah shall be her name, and I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. So he's confirming again. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said in his heart, will a child be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before thee. But God said, no, but Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. It means laughter. And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I will bless him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall become the father of 12 princesses, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this season next year. So his promise is becoming more specific now that Abraham waited for a long time. He stumbled a few times, but he rose again in faith. And God is saying, okay, now the time's really close. Next year, during this season, Sarah will bear a son. And when he finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. Then Abraham took Ishmael his son, and all the servants who were born in his household, all who were bought with money, every male among the men of Abraham's household, and circumcised the flesh of their foreskin in the very same day, as God had said to them. So he is just executing in obedience immediately what God told him to do. Yeah. So when God says something, one aspect of Abraham that really stands out is that he puts into action immediately. Like, he does not waver, but he obeys immediately. And that act of faith is probably making God renew his covenant with him, because he sees this potential that he's a man of faith. So we're going to cover Genesis 17 another time, but let's just go through Puritanism a little bit. Over on page 38. Puritanism is another tradition that we really want to actually take a look at, because it, of course, started in England, but it was transferred to America, right? And we stand on the ground where Puritans actually moved, they fled for religious freedom, and upon their faith foundation, we are standing as citizens. And so let's take a look at this. Puritans was the name given in the 16th century to the more extreme Protestants within the Church of England, who thought the English Reformation had not gone far enough. So there was a reformation in order to purify Christianity, because there was so many there was significant matters, there was so much corruption, and they were trying to really reform. So they wanted to purify their national church by eliminating every shred of Catholic influence. In the 17th century, many Puritans emigrated to the New World, where they sought to find a holy commonwealth in New England. Puritanism remained the dominant cultural force in the area into the 19th century. Yeah, so when we say New World, it means United States of now. Back in that day, it was called New World, America, right? Where they sought to find a holy commonwealth. Yeah, so they settled on the East Coast. No single theology or definition of the church. The English Puritans were known at first for the extremely critical attitude regarding the religious compromises made during the reign of Elizabeth the First, right? Many of them were graduates of Cambridge University, so these are kind of intellects. They became Anglican priests to make changes in their local churches. They encouraged direct personal religious experience, sincere moral conduct. So it has to be personal experience, not to be individualistic, but you yourself have to experience it on a personal level. Sincere moral conduct. So behaviors are important, not because behaviors and actions or good deeds save you, but rather because they are the fruits of your relationship with God. And simple worship services. They did not want, because this is kind of a reaction toward Catholic services that were so fancy and so ritualistically sophisticated, but they lacked the heart of worship, and so they were trying to do the opposite. Worship was the area in which Puritans tried to change things most. Their efforts in that direction were sustained by intense theological convictions and definite expectations about how seriously Christianity should be taken as a focus of human existence. After James I became King of England in 1603, Puritan leaders asked him to grant several reforms at the Hampton Court Conference 1604. However, he rejected most of their proposals, which included abolition of bishops. Puritanism, best expressed by William Ames and later by Richard Baxter, gained much popular support early in the 17th century. The government and the church hierarchy, however, especially under Archbishop William Laud, became increasingly repressive, causing many Puritans to immigrate. So there was a persecution from Catholic Church and bishops. Those who remained formed a powerful element within the parliamentarian party that defeated Charles I in the English Civil War. So they started to actually actively participate in the government activities. After the war, Puritans remained dominant in England until 1660, but they quarreled among themselves. Presbyterian dominance gave way to independent or congregational control over Oliver Cromwell and proved even more intolerant than the old hierarchy. The restoration of the monarchy also restored Anglicanism. So monarchy came back 1660, and Puritan clergy were expelled from the Church of England under the terms of Act of Uniformity in 1662. So American Puritanism, so early 17th century, obviously because there was such a persecution in England, they actually separated from the Church of England, came to Plymouth colony, 1620, pilgrims, right? 10 years later, under the auspices of Massachusetts Bay Company, the first major Puritan migration to England, New England, took place. So migration happened. The Puritans brought strong religious impulses to bear in all colonies north of Virginia, but New England was their stronghold, and the Congregationalist churches they established there were able to perpetuate their viewpoint about a Christian society for more than 200 years. So Richard Mather and John Cotton provided clerical leadership in the dominant Puritan colony planted in Massachusetts Bay. So these are two significant people who exercised leadership. Thomas Hooker was an example of those who settled new areas further west according to traditional Puritan standards. Even though he broke with the authorities of the Massachusetts colony over questions of religious freedom, Roger Williams was also a true Puritan in his zeal for personal godliness and doctrinal correctness. Most of these men held ideas in the mainstream of Calvinistic thought. So these are Calvinistic people. In addition to believing the absolute sovereignty of God, total depravity of men, and the complete dependence of human beings on divine grace for salvation, they stressed the importance of personal religious experience. These Puritans insist that they, as God's elect, had the duty to direct national affairs according to God's will as revealed in the Bible. The union of church and state to form a holy commonwealth gave Puritanism direct and exclusive control over most colonial activity, until commercial and political changes forced them to relinquish it at the end of 17th century. So because of its diffuse nature, when Puritanism began to decline in America, it's difficult to say. So a decline happened, but when is kind of hard to say. Some would hold that it lost its influence in New England by 18th century, but Jonathan Edwards and his able disciple Samuel Hopkins revived Puritanism and kept it alive until 1800s. Jonathan Edwards was a Puritan. Others would point to the gradual decline, but Presbyterians under leadership of Jonathan Dickinson and Baptists led by the example of Isaac Beckus revitalized Puritan ideas in several denominational forms through 18th century. During the whole colonial period, Puritanism had direct impact on both religious thought and cultural patterns in America. So they were not only just remained in the religious sector, but they influenced the religion in general, but also they shaped the cultural patterns. In the 19th century, its influence was indirect, but it can still be seen at work, stressing the importance of education in religious leadership and demanding that religious motivations be tested by applying them to practical situations. So they emphasize educating clergy. So this is a very, very simple synopsis of how Puritanism was like. And next week, we're going to talk about the theology of spiritual formation. So let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your grace and mercy. Lord, we are dependent upon you and we need you. And thank you for being a good God who answers our prayers, who is the sustainer of the universe in the midst of all the turmoil.